Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. So, we've reached the year of 1978 on this series. This was the year that I turned 6 years old. And once again, I have a whole smorgasbord of horror goodies to choose from, just an embarrassment of riches. So, this right here necessitates yet another long list of honorable mentions. So, before we get into the entrees, if you will, here are a few hors d'oeuvres, I guess, in the form of five honorable mentions that I thought of that I wanted to include in the list, but obviously, there wasn't room. So first off, we have the actually very decent sequel, Damien Omen 2, which was directed by Don Taylor. Example of like a very, very good sequel. Also got the underseen haunted mansion film, The Evil, which was directed by Gus Triconis, which I feel like more people should see. It's actually really, really good. The spooky witchcraft saga, The Legacy, which was directed by Richard Marquand. Marquand, I guess is how you pronounce his last name. Then you got Joe Dante's very fun, like, killer nature movie, Piranha, which, very, very gory, very, very fun. And the very bizarre and kind of, like, underrated, I feel like, British psychological horror film called The Shout, which is weird as shit if you've never seen it, but it's actually, like, really, really good. That was directed by, actually, a Polish director named Jerzy Skolimowski. So now that we've sampled all of the delights that 1978 has to offer, let's move on to the main course if we want to like continue on with this intractable like food metaphor. So I feel like this is one of the couple of, well, duh entries that are going to appear on this list. And if you know anything about horror, you could probably guess what the other one's going to be. But, I mean, goddamn it, Dawn of the Dead is just such a great goddamn movie. Now, it's obviously the second in George Romero's very long-running Dead series of zombie films. Also my second favorite out of the whole batch, because I'm going to have to give top honors to the 1968 OG, Night of the Living Dead, which is still my favorite after all this time. To be honest, like, to this day, I think that Dawn of the Dead really remains one of the most entertaining zombie movies, like, ever put on film. Has some fantastic gore in it, which, of course, by the master Tom Savini. This was actually his debut as lead special effects guy. He'd worked on films prior to this, obviously, which I'll get into a little bit later on too, but this was the first one where he was kind of like the lead guy, you know what I mean? This has like real fun characters and a really, really wide streak of dark humor and a lot of that social satire that a lot of George Romero's movies are known for. So Dawn of the Dead was actually partly financed by Dario Argento, and he actually flew George Romero to Rome so they could kind of work on the screenplay together. Dario actually later would cut his own version of the film, like with a different score by Goblin, of course. That was for the Italian market. So they did that, from the beginning, like they worked out that deal. So Dawn of the Dead very famously shot at the Monroeville Mall in Pennsylvania during the nighttime hours. So it was like a working mall, but they would just like shoot after everybody left for the day. Now, George Romero apparently got the idea to do this movie in the first place after a friend of his who actually managed that mall or like worked for the company that managed it, he kind of like showed him like all the hidden areas like behind the mall, like all of the kind of secret stuff that nobody gets to see. And I guess like George Romero was jokingly commenting that, someone could easily survive like this horrible dire emergency just by barricading themselves in the mall because, it's got everything you need in here. So the movie also kind of serves as sort of like a sly parody of consumer culture, like, because you have the zombies sort of shuffling mindlessly through the shopping mall, like, blissed out living shoppers who are, dead set on purchasing their happiness in this, like, wonderful, magical place. So the events of Dawn of the Dead take place sometime after the events of Night of the Living Dead, and we're led to understand that even though the zombie outbreak seemed to have been contained back in 1968, at least according to like the end of Night of the Living Dead, it has apparently subsequently slipped its bonds and become unmanageable, and civilization is like pretty much starting to break down in the face of the zombie onslaught. Now, in the midst of all this chaos, we're kind of following a Philadelphia traffic reporter named Steven and his TV producer girlfriend, whose name is Fran, who also happens to be pregnant. Now, once martial law is declared in the city, these two decide they're going to nope out. They're going to steal the TV station's helicopter that they use for traffic reports, and they're going to kind of try to make their own way in this, terrifying new reality where everything's just like turning to shit. Meanwhile, across town, there's a SWAT team, and they're exchanging gunfire with the residents of like a low-income housing project who are essentially like, flying in the face of the law by not turning over their dead relatives to the authorities, which they're supposed to do. So obviously it all turns into a shit show. Like they're all shooting at each other, and then of course like zombies come into play as well. So finally, like after all of this death and destruction, two of the officers, whose names are Roger and Peter, they decide, they're gonna cut bait and they're gonna join up with Steven and Fran because one of them is like friends with Steven. Now, soon after, this whole gang, like, they're flying around in the helicopter, and they come across a shopping mall, and they're kind of able to fight their way inside, and understandably, they decide they're going to hole up there for the time being, since everything they could ever need is within the walls, you know what I mean? They got food, they got medicine, they got, they can secure it pretty easily, like, they drive some trucks in the front, like, so people can't get in, and all this other kind of stuff. So it seems like a really, really good place to hang out pretty much indefinitely. Later on, though, of course, the place gets besieged both by zombies and by a biker gang, who Tom Savini is actually one of the members of the biker gang, because he's an actor as well, in case you didn't know that. So the biker gang is trying to take the place over, too. And then there's kind of like this big all-out battle, one that features many, many delightfully splattery Tom Savini effects. Now, I will say, though, that this has the real bright red blood. Like, Tom Savini would later lament like how bright the blood used in this film was. This was kind of like before he came up with that winning formula that he would use on subsequent films, that he would actually like had this mixture where he would like mix green into it to make it to look darker. So I don't know. I kind of feel like the zombies, even though they look weird in this because they're very blue or gray and like this blood is like bright red. I don't know. I kind of feel like that's sort of like part of the movie's charm because it's not really supposed to be realistic per se. I don't know. I always enjoyed it, and I think a lot of people do as well because it's almost, I don't want to say it's like cartoonish, but it's kind of like over the top and like fantastical, especially with how over the top the gore is, you know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, Dawn of the Dead, it's funny, it's gross, I mean, it's endlessly entertaining, it just, it doesn't, like, drag or anything like that, it's just fun, and it just, like, keeps on going. I mean, this should be on any horror fan's must-watch list. Gonna say, too, the 2004 Zack Snyder remake, not too bad either, although, it actually took kind of a more serious tone, but I think that was probably, like, the right decision, and it kind of, like, went more like a frenetic kind of pace to it, but they did a little bit different with it, but I still liked it anyway. So yeah, that's actually one remake that was absolutely worth watching. But to be honest, like the OG Dawn of the Dead is really like where it's at, and if you haven't seen it, you really, really need to. So this is the other one of the crushingly obvious picks for 1978, John Carpenter's iconic masterpiece, Halloween. Now, obviously, this spawned a far-reaching franchise that's still growing strong to this day. Holy shit, like just this year, they had like Halloween Kills or whatever, which I still haven't seen yet, by the way. Because of how ubiquitous this movie is, I feel like sometimes it's really easy to forget that it all just stemmed from this very, very, like a single, very simple, low-budget movie about a group of neighborhood babysitters basically stalked by a dude in a William Shatner mask. So obviously Halloween wasn't the first slasher film per se. I mean, in terms of establishing the familiar tropes of the subgenre, I would either give that crown to Mario Bava's Bay of Blood, which came out in 1971, or possibly, like, if you're going to quibble about that, maybe like, Bob Clark's 1974 film, Black Christmas, which, had all the POV shots and stuff like that, although Bay of Blood had that as well. But I mean, Halloween was definitely the movie that blew the doors off. I mean, it found such incredible mainstream success. I mean, for a time, it's actually still one of the most successful independent films ever made, like in terms of how much it made back, like over its budget. It got so popular, like largely through word of mouth, they didn't even do a lot of advertising or anything like that, that it almost single-handedly gave rise to the unbelievably like fruitful slasher boom of the 1980s. And I will say too, was actually directly responsible for the subsequent Friday the 13th series, which were very knowingly like made to be a direct ripoff of Halloween. And, Sean Cunningham will say that right to everyone's face. So, like all of John Carpenter's best films, I feel like the assured direction, the very like compelling visuals, and of course that one of his great like atmospheric scores, that iconic theme music, it really lends this very like essentially like really stripped down story this air of menace and kind of like spookiness that's really really hard to top. So I feel like everyone and their mother's pet parakeet like probably knows the plot of Halloween by now. But I mean, just in case we have people that crawled out from under rocks and or recently arrived from outer space that's literally like watching this. The movie is set on Halloween night, obviously, and centers around a group of high school girls who are like babysitting at various houses in their neighborhood in Haddonfield, Illinois, even though the film was actually shot in California. Unbeknownst to them, though, a mental patient named Michael Myers has escaped from custody and is heading back to his hometown, where, as a child many years ago, he actually murdered his sister in cold blood. So, wearing his, trademark boiler suit and this very eerie blank white mask, which, like I said, was actually a William Shatner mask painted white with, like, the eye holes made bigger. So Michael's like stalking around the streets of these pleasant suburbs, like slaying everyone that comes across his path pretty much, while his frantic physician, Dr. Loomis, obviously played by the awesome Donald Pleasance, attempts to warn the townspeople about the threat he poses, like that he's actually evil, and tries to stop Michael from killing more people, like before it's too late. So everything about Halloween is perfect. It's like, it's very easy to see why audiences in 1978 immediately responded to it and why horror fans have made it, again, like one of the most ubiquitous and beloved like franchises in the genre. Like Michael Myers is an icon in horror for a reason. I mean, the film is very concise. It's very beautifully shot. It has really likable, relatable characters, particularly, of course, famously the final girl, Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis. This was the movie that cemented her enduring status as a scream queen. Man, she's still being in Halloween movies this many fucking years later, which is crazy. The story is very uncomplicated. It's kind of like specific to a time and place, but it's also like universal to all times and places, which is like a really hard thing to, pull off. And it kind of taps into the same primal anxieties that are explored in like urban legends. And it is very much based around like an urban legend type of narrative, which I think is the reason why it resonates with so many people. So, I mean, and that too, like kind of lends, which is, it's largely like a realistic story, but it also gives it like a slight air of like mystery or like the supernatural, which I think people like find really appealing. And Michael Myers, I mean, it has to be said, is a particularly frightening antagonist. I mean, he's relentless, he's shark-like. He doesn't really seem to have any motive other than killing and destruction, and there's no sense at all that he could possibly be reasoned with. Like, he almost doesn't, like, seems like a force of nature, like not even a person. I mean, in the movie, like, the shots of him just, like, standing there, like, in the neighbor's yard, like, very unhurriedly, like, watching the house from afar, or just, like, stepping out from behind that hedge or something like that, are just really, really unsettling, because he's just, like I said, he's almost like a force of nature, and he's just, like, that he's there, and he's just gonna be there, and it's like, he's not in any rush to get you, but he's gonna get you, you know what I mean? It's, like, super creepy. I mean, the original Halloween, obviously, wisely keeps everything about the killer unknown, making him a lot more chilling, I think, at least in my opinion. I think later sequels and remakes, Rob Zombie, that attempted to kind of give him a backstory or a motivation or a personality, I think that really kind of drastically undercut what was so scary about him in the first place, like in the first film, the perception of him only as the shape. Like, you could kind of like project whatever your fears were onto it, because he was almost like a blank slate, you know what I mean? He was just like this faceless, like ghostly kind of killer, like almost not even human. And the thing about it is that even though there have been like millions of, sequels and reboots and stuff like that, but I mean, at the time of its release, I mean, Halloween was just lightning in a bottle. Like, everything about the movie came together flawlessly, just in one very spooky, very satisfying, very scary package. And I don't think that that could ever be replicated. Although I'm not like shitting on the extended franchise, because like some of the sequels and stuff like that were good. But I mean, they were never going to top the original, because that was just kind of like everything just came together into this perfect storm of awesomeness, and you can't really like do better than that. So Jack Finney's 1955 novel, The Body Snatchers, has been directly adapted. It's been indirectly adapted a couple times too, but it's been directly adapted into film 4 times, including versions made in 1956. There was one made in 1993 by Abel Ferrara, I think, and in 2007. But in my opinion, the 1978 adaptation, which was directed by Philip Kaufman, is the best one, or at least I think is my favorite. I think like the great thing about Jack Finney's original story, like the original source novel, is that it's so adaptable. Like depending on the time period the film was made in, it could kind of like explore anything from like McCarthyism and the Red Menace, like that's the one like from 1956 did that. You got like maybe like the inherent conformity of military systems, or like a metaphor for the spread of AIDS, like that's kind of what the 1993 film did. Or you could do something like the 2007 version, which explored a bunch of muddled bullshit that seemed to be trying to say something incomprehensible about the war in Iraq or something like that. I wasn't really sure like what the message of that one was. The 1978 Invasion of the Body Snatchers, though, I kind of feel like it largely sort of takes aim at consumerism and maybe like the lost ideals of the countercultural 1960s. So the movie's set in San Francisco, and it's kind of like set amid a group of people who are either like ex-hippies that are kind of like now working for the man and they're like up in the system, or people who are kind of still in that mindset who have retained kind of like their distrust of conformity, their distrust of government, and their beliefs in like various new age type of ideas. So you have that kind of like thing going on. And then you have like Leonard Nimoy's character, his name is Dr. Kibner, and he's like a particularly interesting foil, I guess, to all of this. Like he's this guru type psychiatrist with this really passionate, almost like cult like following, like because he's written all these best-selling self-help books, which are just kind of these, you know, it's just kind of like one of those fucking self-help books, you know what I mean? One of those kind of like stupid, yeah, it's all right, blah 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 kind of things. And it's funny because once he gets assimilated into the pod people, he makes like what sounds like a pretty reasonable sounding argument to the remaining holdouts that haven't been assimilated yet, that they should just succumb to the invasion because it'll take away all their fear and anxiety. It'll make your life much easier. And it's kind of like he tries to tempt them with this siren song of conformity. But the thing about it is that these characters are all these kind of like dubious, distrustful, like individualists essentially, and they just don't have a lot of patience for that. And it's almost kind of like, it's interesting, like seeing those two like contrasting kind of things, and I don't know, I just find that like really amusing. So the other characters in the story include a scientist named Elizabeth Driscoll, and she's kind of the first one. She notices this weird flower that's like growing in her neighborhood one day, and she brings it home only to have her boyfriend start acting really, really strangely like the next day. And then there's also her friend and work colleague whose name is Matthew Bennell. He's a health inspector. And when she kind of like tells him about the weird shit that's been going on, Matthew actually at first advises her to see the aforementioned Dr. Kibner, who's Leonard Nimoy, about her supposed fantasies that her boyfriend isn't her boyfriend anymore, even though he looks exactly the same as he always has, and she can't exactly articulate like how he's different. Now, meanwhile, there's two other friends named Jack and Nancy Belichick, and they make a disturbing find in the kind of like mud spa thing that they run. It's a seemingly dead body, but it looks almost exactly like Jack, but it's almost like it's not done yet. You know what I mean? Like it's being like stamped out of wax or something. Now, as everybody kind of gets together to compare notes about all this like bizarro shit that's been going on, and as more mysterious bodies start turning up that like resemble one or the other of them, which like I said, that would be a little alarming. The group starts to figure out that the flower that Elizabeth found at the beginning was just kind of like the harbinger of a full-blown alien invasion, right? I mean, the intergalactic intruders are using plant pods to make perfect duplicates of the humans, which will be pretty much exact in every detail, except for the people will have a complete lack of emotion, like they'll be soulless, essentially, and they will just be compelled to work for the betterment of the alien life forms, almost like they're a hive mind. So this version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it's just chock full of that 70s era paranoia, because remember there were so many like had stuff like The Parallax View and like All the President's Men, and you had like kind of all these political thrillers like from the 1960s, like post Watergate, and this kind of has that sort of vibe to it too, which I think works really well, like with this story. And I think it also is kind of like maybe subtly lampooning the whole "I'm okay, you're okay" like atmosphere of the 1970s, like the whole self-help movement, and it's kind of like skewering that a little bit. But I mean, this version has just like a stellar cast, has outstanding effects work, like the pods and the people. That looks great. And I also got to say too that this has one of the bleakest and most unnerving ending scenes in all of horror. I mean, if you've seen it, it's like pretty fucking creepy. It's pretty creepy what happens like at the end with fucking Donald Sutherland and that face and that noise that he makes. So this movie, it's not quite a straight horror film. It's kind of more like psychological horror adjacent drama, I guess. Kind of like a thriller too, maybe. I don't know. It's kind of like one of those things that's like hard to classify. So Magic was directed by Richard Attenborough. And I have to say that this boasted one of the creepiest TV ad campaigns like in TV history. And a lot of people said like when they saw the commercials for this, because I remember the commercials for this running when I was a little kid, like on TV, that they were really freaked out by them. And it's like, I can totally see, you can see them on YouTube. They're like pretty creepy. They might not creep people out nowadays, but if you were a kid back then, they were pretty creepy. I mean, it helps that any kind of horror movie, or it doesn't even have to be a horror movie, but anything that has like a ventriloquist dummy in it is always going to have a leg up, like in the creepy ass department, because vent figures are like pretty much without exception, like terrifying abominations against all that is good and true and right. I mean, they're so fucking creepy. So it's like, it's really, really easy to like make a really disturbing movie like with one of those in it. So the movie was adapted to the screen by the wonderful, wonderful William Goldman, who also wrote the original novel. He also wrote The Princess Bride, by the way, if you were curious. And it features a really incredible performance by a quite young Anthony Hopkins. Also has some real entertaining turns from Burgess Meredith, who's always great. And Anne Margaret is in this well. She's also great. Now, the structure of the movie is slightly, I don't know if I want to say it's odd. It's a little bit weird, like especially by today's standards. But it's kind of told in two distinct parts. But both sections are dealing with the tragic main character of a ventriloquist named Corky Withers, who's obviously played by Anthony Hopkins, and his kind of crumbling mental state, which is evidenced by his increasingly disquieting interactions with his creepy as fuck dummy, whose name is Fats. So Corky starts out as kind of like a terrible stage magician. His main problem being his lack of confidence. Like, it sabotages him, and obviously he keeps messing up, and he can't really, he's not really confident enough to just like blow it off or to like be compelling or anything like that. So he comes on stage and he's fumbling around, and audiences, of course, are like heckling the shit out of him. So after his mentor tells him, well, you need to if you want to do this, you need to find some kind of like angle or some kind of gimmick or something like that, because you're never going to succeed like with doing what you're doing. So Corky hits upon the idea of incorporating this dummy named Fats into his act that will actually like berate and insult him before the audience gets a chance to. So this novel approach actually works like gangbusters, because now he can kind of like mess up, and then he just has to have Fats come in and like yell at him for messing up, and everybody laughs. You know what I mean? It's like comedy. Like, so everybody watching like thinks it's hysterical that Fats is now like these really, really cruel and kind of like witty barbs that he's throwing at Corky, and that also kind of like throws sympathy onto Corky, because he's like, oh my God, I'm being like insulted by this like mean dummy. So it's like, it works out really well. Like, the dynamic is really good. And also it helps that like Fats is like really funny. Like, all the mean shit he comes up with is like really witty and like really funny. So the ventriloquist agent, whose name is Ben Green, who again played by Burgess Meredith, he actually gets Corky a shot at his own primetime TV show because his stage shows have been so popular. So he's basically like, man, you're going to get your own TV show. You're going to have like wealth and success beyond your wildest dreams. And Corky is initially like, awesome. But then he finds out that he's going to have to take like a medical exam, like for the TV station's like insurance purposes, obviously. And when he finds that out, he essentially like loses his shit, because Corky, you see, knows that he has severe mental health issues, which he's so far been able to conceal, like, under the guise of his act with Fats. Like, in reality, the dummy is essentially like a manifestation of his id or his dark side or whatever. And as such, like, Corky seems to perceive him as something of a separate being, but he also does seem to be at least partially aware that this is also the bad side of him that has to kind of be like kept in check. So because he's afraid of what the medical exam might reveal about his mental state, Corky decides to say fuck all that wealth and success, and he's going to skip town without telling anyone where he's going. Now at this point, the film goes like in a slightly different direction. This is like going into like the second part, like I was talking about. Now because he doesn't have any family or friends or anything, Corky ends up at this old resort, like in the Catskills, near where he grew up. Now, while he's there, he ends up reconnecting with this woman named Peggy, who's played by Anne Margaret, who he had like an unrequited crush on in high school. Now, Peggy is married now, but her husband, Duke, is kind of like a controlling chode, who she's kind of trying to get away from. She's like, yeah, I'm fucking sick of this dude. And since he's actually out of town when Corky arrives, like to rent a cabin, the pair of them kind of like rekindle a friendship or strike up a friendship that eventually blossoms into romance. Now, at first, everything seems idyllic. I mean, Corky is very shy and a little bit awkward, but he's also very gentle, he's very compassionate, and he's like the exact opposite of the husband that Peggy can no longer stand to be around. She even thinks, again, at first, that Corky's dialogues with Fats are like kind of charming and not really at all strange. Like, she thinks it's cool, like that he can do like this ventriloquy and that he does magic tricks and stuff like that. Like, she doesn't think it's weird at all. She thinks it's like actually kind of cute. But as time goes on, Corky's mask of sanity, I guess, like starts to slip, and Peggy starts to realize how deep his problems really run. Now, she still loves him, and she even considers like leaving her husband so that her and Corky can run away together. So maybe she doesn't entirely realize like how mentally ill he is. But yeah, so there's that. But she does like still love him and want to run away with him. But of course, this pipe dream is not to be. Like, Fats's hold on Corky becomes ever more pronounced, like as the movie goes on, to a point where Corky does horrible things, like up to and including murder, without really fully being aware that he's doing them, basically like attributing all of the violence to Fats. So it's a really, really sad story, but it's also like eerie as hell. And I would submit that Anthony Hopkins' performance here goes a long way toward explaining why this is such a compelling movie. Like, he's such a sympathetic character that you can't help but feel for him and root for him, even though the whole time you know that his issues are so acute that it's all going to, you know, end in tears one way or the other. There's just like no way that there's any coming back from this, you know what I mean? And it should probably go without saying, because, like I said, ventriloquist dummies. But Fats is a very frightening, like, figure throughout the film. Like, he's kind of like, he's very wisecracking and, like, funny and stuff, but in a way that's, like, edged with a threat, you know what I mean? Like, he always seems like threatening, like even when he's supposedly being funny. Like, it's just like teetering on the edge of like, just like really, really menacing. I mean, you almost get the sense, like Corky has, that the dummy is its own being, like it's a separate person. But then, like, as you're watching and you realize that the doll is simply an expression of all of Corky's darkest desires, that kind of makes the whole thing even more troubling and like even more disturbing while you're watching it. So, I mean, this movie, it's just like a really, really good, like very complex examination of like a complete mental breakdown, essentially. And I feel like it's definitely a movie that doesn't really get much of the praise it deserves. It's kind of a cult classic, I guess, but you don't really hear a lot of people talking about it, and more people totally should. And speaking of movies that don't get talked about as much as they should, this is George Romero's second appearance on this list. And again, this is a movie that doesn't, I mean, when you talk about George Romero, as everybody immediately goes to zombies, but this movie here, I kind of feel like if you have even a passing interest in 70s horror, you absolutely should see this movie. Now, ostensibly, it's a vampire movie, but it's actually more concerned with psychological horror and also maybe like the way in which beliefs or legends like shape our behavior. So Martin was actually cited by George Romero himself as his very favorite of all the films he's ever made. So if that doesn't make you want to see it, I don't know what will. This was, incidentally, also George Romero's first collaboration with Tom Savini. Like I said, he did work on Dawn of the Dead, obviously, but that was the first movie where he was like the lead special effects guy. This was actually the first movie they did together, and Tom Savini, I believe, I don't think he was the lead effects guy on it, but he did do like a few effects in it. Like there's one like really realistic like wrist being cut open and stuff like that that Tom Savini worked on. And I think he did like a staking scene in there as well, but this was the first time that they had worked together. Now, I believe Martin was initially conceived by George Romero to be about an actual vampire, but the final version of the movie takes what I thought was like the more interesting tack of not really specifying whether the protagonist is an actual centuries-old vampire or is simply a delusional killer with kind of like an all-encompassing fantasy persona. So John Amplas plays the title character, and he's this young man, and he's traveling to Pittsburgh. I think he's coming from Indianapolis, and he's going to stay with his very stern uncle. I think it's his uncle, whose name is Tata Kuda. Now, while he's on the train, like to his destination, he drugs a woman and cuts open her wrist to like drink her blood. So it's interesting because the reality of this, which is very, very ugly and very appalling and grungy and gross looking as it would be in real life, is intercut with Martin's romanticized perceptions of what's happening, which are all in like sepia tone. And he looks very much like a vampire, like from an old school, like, you know, silent film or something like that. It's very, like I said, romanticized with like the white flowing shirts and, you know, the willing victim and everything like that. That's how he's seeing it. But then it's juxtaposed with like what's really happening, that he just jumped on this woman and drugged her and like cut her wrist open and shit like that. It's like, it's really horrific, like the way it's done. So when he meets Tatakuda at the train station, it's immediately obvious that this codger is old school. Like, whether Martin is an honest-to-goodness vampire or not, which, like I said, the movie doesn't really take a stand on that, Tatakuda wholeheartedly believes that this kid is an actual, legit vampire. To a point where he's even, like in the old movies, he's like thrusting garlic and crosses at him, calling him Nosferatu and stuff like that. And this just actually kind of makes Martin laugh. Like, even though Martin also believes himself to be a vampire, he's very much of the, oh, all that supernatural stuff from the books like is bullshit kind of vampire. So there's that kind of clash going on. So Tatakuda also has a granddaughter named Christina, who she also lives in the house where Martin's going to be staying. Now, she's a little bit older than Martin, and I believe she's played by George Romero's eventual wife. And she actually like takes a shine to, you know, the awkward guy. She really doesn't have much patience for Tatakuda's like old world shenanigans. Like, she knows that Martin has problems, but she's kind of more encouraging him to take like a more pragmatic approach. Like, maybe you should get counseling, or maybe you should go see a psychiatrist or something like that. She knows he has problems, but she's like, obviously, like, pretending he's a vampire is not going to do him any good. So over the course of the movie, like, Martin targets more victims, and he also ends up becoming something of like an anonymous local celebrity keeps like calling into a popular radio show, like a talk show, and he calls himself the Count, and he tells all the listeners like the truth about vampires and like how they really operate, like how all that stuff from the movies is bullshit and all that kind of stuff. Even though when he sees himself killing somebody, he actually sees as though it's like scenes from like old romanticized vampire movies, like I said. So that's kind of like funny. There's like a funny irony going on there. So the tragedy of this movie then arises, like I said, from the clash of all the characters' beliefs. Martin legitimately believes that he needs blood to survive, which leads him to kill people, even though he seemingly, or I guess from his own perception, he keeps his fantastical beliefs grounded by insisting that he's technically not supernatural. Like, all that stuff, the magic stuff from the books and stuff, isn't true. Then you have Tatakuda, who also believes that Martin is a vampire, but in a more traditional sense, which ultimately, spoiler alert, leads to him destroying the boy instead of trying to help him. And then you have poor Christina, the granddaughter, who's just kind of like caught in the middle, thinking that basically they're both different flavors of crazy and kind of lamenting the fact that neither of them will admit that they're both deranged. Now, in the end, the interesting thing about this movie, like I said, and the way that the reason that I liked that it left things ambiguous was that in the end, it doesn't actually matter whether Martin was a real vampire or not, because the belief that he was caused all of the unfortunate outcomes for everyone involved. So if you like vampire movies, or actually like even if you don't, but are interested to see a different take on the monster that almost kind of want to goes meta with it a little bit, then Martin is kind of like, this is another like must see. It's very low budget, it's kind of scuzzy, but it's a really interesting take on the vampire legend and kind of in a larger sense about the power of belief and myth to kind of like shape our perceptions of the world. So that will wrap up 1978, but be sure to keep watching this space for whenever it is that I get around to 1979. It'll probably be in December sometime. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm really having a good time doing this series. And remember to like and share the video if you enjoy this content. And please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, pop over to scaresalon.com where I have a lot more written content, book reviews, movie reviews, a lot more horror adjacent content that you can read. And that'll do it for this installment. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.